Good morning, I'm Ellen Horseman. Welcome to Sunday School with Camden, Arkansas's First United Methodist Church. Just got done with a great Advent series that was a lot of fun, and now we're jumping right over to the day after Christmas. This week I'm just going to go with the lectionary text, and then beginning next week, or so my plan is, I'm going to be using this study by Adam Hamilton called John, the Gospel of Light and Life. It's a fun study, only 6 weeks long, so it's more like a little introduction to the Gospel of John, but I think you'll enjoy it. But let me get to the lectionary text. That's what I decided. I'd use the lectionary text in the Gospel for this week. And so here we are, the day after Christmas. We just had that big high of Christmas Day, and now here we are finishing out the second chapter of the Gospel of Luke, beginning with verse 41. Each year his parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When he was 12 years old, they went to Jerusalem according to their custom. After the festival was over, they were returning home, but the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't know it. Supposing that he was among their band of travelers, they journeyed for a full day while looking for him among their family and friends. When they didn't find Jesus, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple. He was sitting among the teachers, listening to them and putting questions to them. Everyone who heard him was amazed by his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were shocked. His mother said, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Listen, your father and I have been worried. We've been looking for you." Jesus went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. His mother cherished every word in her heart. Jesus matured in wisdom and years and in favor with God and with his people. So like I was saying, here we are. If you're watching this on the day that I recorded it for, it's the day after Christmas, or if you're listening to it, it's a day or two or whatever after Christmas. Christmas is over with. For weeks, we've been building up to that point. And I don't know about you, but for me, there's always a bit of a letdown after Christmas. It was a really big letdown when I was a kid because I'd be so excited about Christmas, could hardly sleep the night before. Yay! And then the next day was just an ordinary day. And of course, when I became an adult, the next day meant that I had to start working again. When I was in the business world, it was right off to work. And when I was a teacher, it was, okay, time to grade those semester exams. So it can be a bit of a letdown after coming to this high. It's just an ordinary day after all the anticipation and joy of the holidays. It's just an ordinary day. When I was thinking about that, it made me think about how the church has some Sundays in its liturgical year, and this isn't one of them, that are called ordinary time. Of course, I've always thought that was funny, even though I know that the ordinary there is actually referring to numbers. But that's the way this feels right now, doesn't it? The day after Christmas, ordinary time. Well, I'm going to tell you that this story that we looked at here, this story which is slated for the very day after Christmas, is kind of an ordinary time story as well. Or at least it might have been for the Holy Family. Think about it. Luke says that every year they traveled all the way to Jerusalem for the Passover. So that would have been a high religious holiday. Not the giving of gifts like we do, but a very important holiday and holy day in their religion. They probably traveled in a large group, walking however many days to get there, anticipating this religious ceremony, this religious service. But now they're walking back, so things are back to ordinary times. But maybe it wasn't so ordinary for Jesus. He'd been there before. But this time, when the family group starts back, he stays in the temple. And obviously, he really wanted to be in the temple. I got a big kick out of a Reverend Mandy England Cole because she said it occurred to her to ask her son, who was 12 years old, why he thought that Jesus had stayed behind in the temple when everybody else had left. And her son said, well, maybe he had a big experience at the celebration and he just had to be at the church. Isn't that a great insight? And it gets better, because then she went on and asked her son, well, why do you think the storyteller in the Gospel of Luke included only this one story from Jesus' childhood? And her son answered her, because Jesus was choosing the church on his own for the first time. And why wouldn't they include that in the story? Isn't that a nice, refreshing way to look at it? Yes, Luke includes this story here for a reason. I mean, obviously we can see in it that Jesus appears to be amazing, because he seems like a wonder kid, as I want to call them. And we'll find out sometimes if you read, you'll see that people who were famous throughout history, sometimes there will be stories about them as a very young man or as a boy of just being some kind of a marvelous, wonderful thing. Think about King David. What's one of the earliest stories we have of him? He's just a kid when he goes against Goliath. Let's see, who else can I think of? Well, Octavius Caesar. He wasn't a kid, but just a very young man when he supposedly made a speech at the Senate that amazed even the very old and experienced senators. But Luke isn't just including this in here so we can see that Jesus was some kind of a wonder kid. I will tell you that something's going on with Jesus here at the temple. Think about it. He's been there for 3 days sitting at the feet of these rabbis, asking questions and answering their questions to the point that people are amazed at his understanding. He's obviously growing in spiritual maturity because he's wanting to begin to make God the Father his priority. But I would say that Jesus still has a lot to learn. Now his parents, who've been looking all over the place for him, find him. And while we just read that everybody else was amazed at his understanding, we don't see that Mary and Joseph are being so amazed at his understanding. What we hear is when his parents saw him, they were shocked. Well, the word shocked that's used here, according to a Professor Scott Spencer, actually it might be better to be translated as dumbfounded, shocked, and perhaps a bit ashamed. And according to Professor Spencer, in this culture, a displaced son was a disgraced son who brought shame on the family. Independence represented insolence rather than the go-getting initiative that we tend to admire today. And so how does Mary react? I'm going to put it this way, she upbraids Jesus. She said, "Child, why have you treated us like this?" Child, she's reminding him he's still a child. "And listen, your father and I have been worried. We've been looking for you." The term worried here, according to Thayer's Greek English lexicon, really is better translated to mean to be in anguish, to be tormented. So Mary is saying, boy, where have you been? You've tormented your father and me. Or to put it in more modern terms, what were you thinking? What were you thinking coming off like this? So she's kind of scolding him. And she's being essentially just like most of us parents might be when our preteen does something so annoying. Now, the answer that Jesus gives, well, why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house? There's a little bit of it that sounds a little bit like a lippy teenager or pre-teenager, doesn't it? Maybe Jesus doesn't mean to be sassy, but he's so into this moment. He is so involved in this moment of spiritual high that he can't figure out why everybody else isn't feeling the same way. Luke tells us that Mary and Joseph do not understand what he says to them. But the good thing about this story is that Jesus doesn't decide to just, wave them aside. I want to talk about Mary for a minute in this story. Mary's not a spiritual novice. She doesn't understand what Jesus is saying here, but it's not like she's never heard before that Jesus might be special. It is in Luke's gospel that we get the Annunciation to Mary. And then she goes and visits with Elizabeth, who also says things about this child that is coming to Mary. Then the shepherds come, and Mary ponders about what they've said. So she's had a lot of moments in which her faith has been pushed and challenged to recognize what Jesus is. But then we have to think about it, day in and day out, she was taking care of him. But I think that for Mary, just as it is for us, her faith would have been a lifelong journey, probably with some peaks and valleys, but something that's continual, a continual growth. She had to have been growing spiritually before the angel ever showed up, or she wouldn't have been so ready to answer. And she's continuing to ponder and to hear what people say. She's pondered the words that she's heard from the shepherds, and she pondered the words that she hears from Simeon when they take Jesus when he's 8 days old and have him presented at dedicated at the temple. And she ponders the words that she hears from him. And here she's pondering again. Here's another sign. And maybe from time to time Mary needs another sign to remind her of how special Jesus is supposed to be. Professor Chelsea Harmon with the Calvin Theological Seminary says, that it makes sense that Mary would need occasional signs, since after all, Mary is the one who nursed Jesus, who put his diapers on him, who taught him how to walk, who taught him how to talk, who knows, wiped his nose when it was running, kissed his bruises when he hurt himself. I mean, she's seen him in the most ordinary day in and day out way. So as Harmon says, day in and day out, year after year, we can easily forget and take for granted how miraculous life is, let alone the thought that your baby will save the world. So we have this wonderful situation here where Mary is being reminded, and we just see that as Mary and Joseph went about raising Jesus and their other children, that these moments, like this one here, that these moments for Mary reminded her that Jesus was something more, but that these moments also happened among the ordinary and mundane moments of life. It's a story that captures the human faith condition quite well. I mean, as Professor Harmon says, we are so into the ordinary business of living that every once in a while we get awakened, sometimes a little harshly, by reminders that the story of God is always at work and that God is keeping his promises whether we acknowledge it or not. And so, of course, as the story goes on, Jesus goes home and he is obedient to his parents. But back again, now, I mean, why is this story here? It's nice for us to take a look at Mary's growing faith, but why else is it here? Is it just to show us that Jesus is this amazing wonder kid? Is it to show us something else? I think it may be here to show us that Jesus grows and matures just like we do. After all, it's kind of framed. I mean, this right at the text before what I read to you, verse 40, which comes after they've dedicated the child, Luke says, "The child grew up and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and God's favor was upon him." And then he ends this series that we just read here saying, Jesus matured in wisdom and years and in favor with God and God's people. Do we often think about the fact that if Jesus is going to mature in wisdom and years, that means he had to grow up? It just kind of shows how God had chosen such an ordinary life that he had to grow up. I was talking a minute ago, that Mary had to teach him how to walk and all the things that we do with a young child. He had to learn to walk, and he had to learn to read, and he had to learn to become more mature in his temperament and in his judgment. So as Reverend Cole puts it, Jesus didn't birth out of the womb already a full and complete Messiah. He wasn't a fully assembled action figure straight out of the box. He, like us, had to grow into the fullness of himself and of his unique identity. Maybe the ordinary is not so disheartening after all. Yeah, we might feel a little let down after Christmas, and these are ordinary times. But maybe ordinary is a good thing. It was good enough for Jesus. Jesus lived just like we did in an ordinary childhood. For all his precociousness, this Son of God still had a lot to learn. He's over here at age 12. He's amazing people in the temple with his answers and his understanding, but he still has a lot to learn from his parents. Simple, ordinary, common day, everyday people. As Professor Scott points out, there's this one story after the dedication at the temple where Jesus is eight days old. We just have this one other story from Jesus' childhood. And it shows us that Jesus was willing to leave his dazzling performance at the Jerusalem temple to return to his humble home, obedient to his parents. Humble origins, humble upbringing, humble faithfulness in the joys and sorrows of everyday life. That's how Jesus came to know God more deeply, to serve God more fully. By humble faithfulness in the joys and sorrows of everyday life. My friends, I'm going to pray that you and I can learn from this story, that ordinary is okay, that we can learn more. And Jesus had a lot more to learn. He was going to spend another 18 years doing that learning before he started his public ministry. But we can learn about faithfulness and the joys and sorrows of everyday life. We can learn to love God more deeply. We can learn to serve God more fully. So may we find God in our ordinary moments. And then may we be like Mary, who took time to ponder in her heart the wonderful things that the God of love had done for her and that the God of love does for us. Have a very great week after Christmas and a very good New Year, and we will see you again, let's see, January the 2nd. Bye-bye, and God bless you.